Katie, we need you to stop to share the screen if you are sharing.
Good evening. Good evening. On behalf of the Newark Public Library, Director Christian Zabriskie, and the Board of Trustees, welcome. I'm Tom Ankner, the Supervising Librarian in charge of the Charles F. Cummings, New Jersey Information Center here at the library. We are always excited to host events by the Newark History Society. We are delighted to be partnering again with NJPAC. Tonight's program will feature Lawrence Spinelli, the author of a new biography of Peter Rodino. Just to take care of some housekeeping items, please help yourself to food if you haven't already. The food is being generously provided by the Newark History Society. Restrooms are through the reference room, out the doors, to the gallery, and to the right. If for any reason we need to exit the building, please follow the exit signs. We ask that people hold their questions or comments until after the presentation tonight. We will take questions from people here in the library, as well as those of you viewing the program remotely. Microphone will be passed to those of you here in person. People on Zoom can type any comments or questions in either the chat box or the Q&A box. We will get to as many as possible after the speaker has concluded his talk. Thank you very much. And now here is Daniela Fonseca of NJPAC.
Thank you, Chris. Hello. Good evening, everybody. As an anchor culture institution, NJPAC is proud to produce events that showcase this great city's history and the people who make it possible. I would like to highlight some of our programming this coming up this month in November. At NJPAC, we have the PV James Moody Festival happening. And we have some great jazz performers that are going to be with us, such as Christian McBride, Lisa Fisher, Diana Riggs. And we also going to have George Clinton with us on Thursday. And we are actually offering 2 tickets for the people that are here on in person. You can just get a ticket with our volunteers, and Tim will raffle the tickets at the end of the night. I also want to highlight some of our events that we're going to have this month. On November 17th, we have the Jazz Crawl. It's going to happen from noon to 6 p.m. We're going to be at Just Fish Bar Grill, Heritage Hall, Clement Place. So if you go into our website, you can get all the information and the right times for each one of the places. And we also gonna have on Monday a very important panel for our program that's standing in solidarity. We're gonna be discussing the future of child welfare in New Jersey. So we all welcome. We'll be there at 6 p.m. You can also go on the website or just come over to the NJPAC and join us. Thank you, New York Historical Society and New York Public Library for partnering with NJPAC Community Engagement and making this lecture series possible. We have a long wait for our next program, but I hope to see all of you back here in April. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you. I'm Tim Christ, the president of the Newark History Society, and I'm pleased to welcome those of you who are here in person, and we already have several dozen people who joined us online. And it's especially good to see so many of you who have been longtime supporters and members of the Newark History Society. We've organized over 100 events over public programs over the last 20 plus years. And I want to thank the members who are here, members of the Newark History Society, because it's your interest and your financial support that makes these programs possible. And I'm grateful, of course, also to our partners, the Newark Public Library and NJPAC Community Engagement. It's so important that we create these public spaces for the community. And we're delighted to welcome Larry Spinelli tonight to discuss Peter Rodino's roots in Newark's Little Italy and his 40-year career on Capitol Hill in Congress, representing Newark and nearby towns, most notably during the Watergate hearings 50 years ago. Tonight is a bit of a homecoming, I understand, for Larry. He was born in Belleville. He often came here to the library as a teenager and was even a ticket agent for a summer job in the old public service building up near Military Park. He then attended Drew University and Georgetown University before earning his PhD in history at New York University. And it was Carl Prince, his PhD advisor at NYU, and faithful member of our Newark History Society, who alerted us to Larry's biography of Peter Rodino, the title of which is Watergate's Unexpected Hero, The Life of Peter W. Rodino, which is a published novel. Some of you will know Carl Prince as a graduate of Wacoic High School, and there's several Wacoic graduates in the room tonight. He was also the editor of New Jersey Governor William Livingston's papers and a distinguished historian of New Jersey in the Revolutionary War and federal period. Others of you may know him for his book about the Brooklyn Dodgers, 1947 to 1957. Carl was unable to join us this evening, but sent me this note and asked me to read it. The truth is, Carl wrote, at age 90, I would want to speak and engage, but no longer find the right words at the moment. I squared this with Larry, one of my best PhDs, and he is okay with it. He dedicated this great study of Rodino to me, to Carl Prince, and came up from DC to give me the first copy. I am as proud of him as anyone could be, and deeply honored. Well, Larry Spinelli served as a press secretary to Peter Rodino, director of communications to then Senator Joe Biden, and eventually director of public affairs of the Overseas Private Investment Corporation during his 4-decade-long career of public service. But Larry, I suspect this commendation from your old PhD advice means almost as all of that. Larry, thank you for joining us tonight and speaking to us about Peter Rodino. Well,
Thank you, Tim, and thank everybody for being here and out there in the Zoom world. And it is, as Tim mentioned, it is great to be back home. You know, when I travel all over the United States, people often say to me, well, you know, where are you from? And I think, well, why are they asking me that question? Are you from New York? Are you from Brooklyn? And I said, well, no, actually, I live in Virginia. They said, well, where's that accent? And I say, what accent? What are you talking about? And of course, you all get it because nobody here said, what about that accent? But I'm very proud of the fact that although I left New Jersey a long time ago, I've not lost my New Jersey accent. I am a very, very, very proud son of the Garden State. And it is great to be back here. I still remember vividly when I was old enough to get on the 28th Summer Avenue bus or the city subway to come down to Newark on my own, to go to Bamberger's or Haynes department store where my mother worked, or the Newark Museum, or of course this absolutely wonderful library, where I then came back to do my research at the Charles Cummings Center on Peter Rodino. It's also fitting to be here tonight. Now, I've been very honored. I got to do a book talk and a book signing at the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library. And I've done a whole series of events in the Washington, D.C. area. But I heard this voice, this raspy voice saying to me, Larry, you need to bring me home. You needed to come back to Newark. Peter Rodino, the epicenter for Peter Rodino. There are still physical reminders of Peter Rodino. He has been dead for 2 decades. The Peter W. Rodino Jr. Federal Building. He helped get the money for that building, and that building in 1978 was named in his honor, still bears his name. The Peter W. Rodino Information Center at Seton Hall University Law School, just a few blocks from here, bears his name, has his papers, his archives, where he did a lot of the research for the book, and memorabilia from his career, including his original congressional desk, which you can go and see. But of course, beyond those physical memories, if you go in any direction, if you draw a circle from where we are tonight in this library, and those of you out there on Zoom, use your imagination, any direction, south, north, east, west, you will touch on some aspect of Peter Rodino's life, from his birth to his funeral mass at St. Lucy's Church. Newark was the epicenter for Peter Rodino, and that's why it's only appropriate that I begin my story tonight in Newark, New Jersey. 51 years ago, Peter Rodino was back home in Newark for the weekend, like he had been every weekend since he became a member of Congress in 1949. He came home, he went to weddings, he went to funerals, he went to birthday parties, he cut ribbons at supermarkets, and he spent hours in his office meeting with constituents because that was very important to him. After a particularly busy day on a Saturday in October, 51 years ago, 1973, he was relaxing in the living room of his house on Grafton Avenue in the North Ward, where he lived for many decades, when across the bottom of the screen came a ticker. And those of you that are in my age group, you remember that when some news flash came, that's what would happen. It was a special bulletin, and it was announcing that the Attorney General of the United States and the Deputy Attorney General of the United States had just resigned because they would not fire the special prosecutor investigating the Watergate scandal as was ordered by then President Richard Nixon. They refused to do it. They resigned. And this was just the culmination of months and months and months of political scandal and tension. And it became known as the Saturday Night Massacre. And it's really hard to put into words how earth-shaking that was. But this is something that's been going on. It started in 1972 in June with the break-in at the Watergate office building at the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee. It was dismissed as a second-rate burglary, but thanks to the dedication of two very young journalists, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein at the Washington Post, they kept investigating. And eventually they unraveled a scandal that involved members of President Nixon's reelection committee and actually went all the way into the White House, those kind of connections. And all of this precipitated the convening of a grand jury and the appointing of a special prosecutor. And the investigation went on. There were indictments and people began making plea bargains. And eventually the Senate put together a special committee and held a series of hearings into this scandal, starting in the spring and through the summer of 1973, Urban Committee. And in the course of which they discovered almost by accident that President Nixon had been recording all the conversations in the White House. So there were these secret tape recording evidence. And what started was back and forth between Congress and the president trying to get those tape recordings. There were calls for looking at the possibility of impeachment, but this was a road nobody wanted to go down. I have to say, we are probably a little numb to impeachments now, but in 1973, there had not been a presidential impeachment since 1868 Andrew Johnson. So nobody wanted to go that route. But that Saturday night tipped the balance. And the next morning, Peter Rodino, who was the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee at the time, did something he had never done before in his entire congressional career. He cut the weekend short, he got on an airplane, and he went back to Washington to plead the case that there should begin an impeachment inquiry and that Rodino and his Judiciary Committee should be in charge of it. Now, there were those in Washington, in the Congress, who thought Rodino shouldn't take this responsibility. The House of Representatives should put together a special committee like the Senate had done. Those people that were proposing that were usually the same people who wanted to be on that special committee or who wanted to be the chairperson of that special committee and become nationally famous. There were other people who legitimately said, well, the House Judiciary Committee was too busy. Why were they too busy? Because they had just started the process of confirming a vice president of the United States. For the first time in the history of the country, the 25th Amendment had been implemented because Spiro Agnew, remember that name? Spiro Agnew had been found guilty of taking kickbacks when he was the governor of Maryland, and he was forced to resign. So the 25th Amendment for the first time was being used to replace a vice president. And the House Judiciary Committee was in charge of the process. People said, you're too busy, you can't take this on. But Rodino went to Washington and he made the case. Carl Albert, Speaker of the House, and said the Judiciary Committee has always been responsible for impeachments, whether they're judges or presidents. We have the full scope of ideologies, of geographies on our committee. We're all lawyers. That's a requirement. We need to take on this responsibility. And Carl Albert said yes. And just a few days later, an impeachment inquiry was begun, the first one since 1868. Now, I have to tell you, if you go back and look at the news clippings then, you'll find that there was a lot of skepticism about whether or not this inquiry was going to be successful, and frankly, whether or not Peter Rodino was going to be successful, because he was relatively unknown outside New Jersey. He had just become the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee at the beginning of the year. So he literally was in the job 10 months. In fact, one newspaper editorial said it was like sending in your relief pitcher in the World Series game when the bases were loaded. Not something you want to do. He also was from Newark, New Jersey. Newark had just suffered through a lot of political scandal caused by Rodino's friend, colleague, and former roommate, Uadonizio. So the feeling was Newark was corrupt, New Jersey was corrupt, Rodino's from Newark. And then finally, he was an Italian American. And there was speculation, there was ethnic stereotyping. Even the prestigious New York Times suggested just maybe Peter Rodino had ties to organized crime. So all of those things were out there suggesting Rodino was not up to the task. But what nobody bothered to do at the time was to take a closer look, to look at Rodino's story, at his biography. Because if they had bothered to take a look, they would have seen a story and experience that would have left little doubt that Rodino had all of the makings to become Watergate's unexpected hero. So let me take you back to the beginning. He was born in 1909 on Factory Street in Newark, not very far from here. Factory Street doesn't exist, but over in by the railroad, Erie-Lackawanna Railroad tracks. And his father, Pellegrino, had come to Newark. He was part of the great migration of Italians from Italy to the United States. Many of them came to Newark. Why? Because Newark was the Silicon Valley of the late 19th, early 20th century. Here was the technology, here were the inventors, here were all the factories lining up and down the Passaic River, and they needed workers. So the immigrants came here for the jobs they were needed. Pellegrino came, made the journey from southern Italy. And Rodino lived in a tenement in Little Italy. Newark's Little Italy was the 5th largest Italian community in the United States. And it was a tough neighborhood. If you've read about it, you know it was tough. The way people easily got ahead was either through bootlegging or through gambling. And at a very early age, Rodino witnessed his first fatal shooting on the corner of Drift Street where he lived. But for some reason, it instilled in him from the beginning, and I think really thanks to his father, was the belief that the law is important, the Constitution is important, and you need to do the right thing. And so Rodino was really on the right path from the beginning. He also benefited from the public school system here in Newark. He went to McKinley Grammar School, where his name, Pellegrino Rodino Jr., was anglicized, as everybody's name was anglicized in the Newark public school system. He became Peter. He added Wallace as a middle name. I was never able to find out why or where that came from. Maybe he just liked the sound of it. And then he had the great good fortune to go to Barringer High School, which was the academic high school. His father supported him. We could have made him go to work. You could go to work at age 14 then in New Jersey, or he could have went to a technical school, but he went to Barringer, and that was the high school for people who wanted to go on to college or to some kind of a profession. And he graduated from Barringer, and he decided he wanted to do something to serve others. He wanted to become a lawyer. So the first step to becoming a lawyer, you didn't need 4 years of college then, but you needed 2 years. So he went to Dana College, named after John Cotton Dana, who founded this library in the Newark Museum. And after that, he was going to go to the New Jersey Law School. Except something happened in 1929. The stock market crashed, the Great Depression, and there were there was no money. His father lost his job. Rodino had part-time jobs and he lost those. He was working at public service and he lost that job. So he had a delay going to school. So for 4 years, showing perseverance, showing commitment, showing patience, all the things that would be his hallmark when he was chairing the Nixon impeachment inquiry were there from the beginning. He kept at it. He done a series of odd jobs. He sold insurance door to door. He worked as the night clerk at the Erie-Lackawanna train station in Harrison. Eventually, he got a good job at the art metal factory down by the river. They made the Ronson cigarette light, famous lighters, wind-proof. The wind wouldn't put them out, and these were the days everybody smoked. So he got a job there, eventually saved up enough money. He was able to go to school at night. This was Peter Rodino's schedule. He would get up at 5 o'clock in the morning. He would get the streetcar or walk from Drift Street down to the art metal factory for 7 o'clock shift. He'd get off the shift at 4 o'clock. He'd walk over to the New Jersey Law School. He would do his classes until 10 o'clock at night. He'd go back home. He'd study till about 2 o'clock in the morning, and then he'd get about 2-3 hours sleep. And the alarm clock would go off. And he said that when he was done with his 3 years of law school, the first thing he did was to throw out that alarm. He set up practice, a little practice, a one-man practice. But what he, again, wanted to do was to help others. So he started holding citizenship classes because Italian Americans were not becoming citizens. They were, is a much lower rate than other newly arrived immigrants. He did citizenship classes in what was then called the First Ward. Then he started holding English classes. And all of this came to the attention of the Democratic leaders in the First Ward, and they invited him to join the First Ward Democratic Club, which he did. He became a spokesman for the New Deal. His first vote ever he cast for Franklin Roosevelt in 1932. He was an unapologetic New Dealer to the day he died. And that eventually put him on the map, and he was a candidate for the New Jersey Assembly in 1940, didn't win. But he got appointed to the draft board as an advisor. And that job actually would have allowed him to not be drafted when they started a peacetime draft prior to Pearl Harbor. But he decided he was going to enlist, and he signed up. He entered as a private, went off to Fort Dix, eventually got sent overseas, was part of the campaign in North Africa. And guess what? He had been a member of the French club at Barringer High School. It's the language they were speaking in North Africa, French. So we became liaison to all the local people. The next step in the Army's campaign was invading Italy. He spoke fluent Italian. So he became a part of the occupation forces in Rome. And when he came back in 1945, starting as a private, he came back as a captain with 2 Bronze Stars, decorated war hero, and decided he wanted to get involved in politics because he wanted to help veterans. He saw veterans camping out in Weequahic Park because they had nowhere to live. And he said, this is not right. So he decided to run. The Democratic Party said, this 10th congressional district, which was represented then by Fred Hartley, you all have heard of the Taft-Hartley law. That's Fred Hartley. He was a Republican. He had held the district for 15 years. They said to Rodino, there's no way you can win this. We're not going to help you. We're not putting any money into this. But Rodino was determined. He believed, and he went out and with his buddy Joe Benucci, they went to every meeting, every group they could get together. He told stories about being in the living room where there were like 2 people there, but he would talk to those 2 people. And eventually, election night, he didn't win, but he came within 5,000 votes of beating Fred Hart. Nobody thought he could do that. So 2 years later, he ran, Fred Hartley retired, and Peter Rodino won and became the congressman, went off to Washington. Now, the number one rule in those days in Congress, which was ruled by the seniority system, was you're seen and not heard. Don't say anything. Peter Rodino obeyed that rule for about 6 weeks. He was on the Veterans Affairs Committee, and the chairman of the committee was John Rankin, who was from Mississippi. He was a segregationist. He was an open anti-Semite, and he was one of the most hated people in the Congress, but he was also the worst autocrat. And he would pass legislation with having votes. He would call meetings without telling anybody. And he did something like this on veterans legislation, and Rodino was furious. He went over to the floor of the House of Representatives to lodge a complaint. And he talks about how he's sitting there waiting to be recognized, and his knees were shaking, and he was just quaking because he knew this was going to be the end of his congressional career, but he had to do it. It was the right thing to do. He waved his hand and got recognized, and he complained the way he was treated. He said, we veterans went to Europe to fight for democracy, not to come home and to be treated by undemocratic behavior. When he was finished speaking, he got spontaneous round of applause. You're not allowed to applaud, but it was just spontaneous. Everybody was so thrilled to see somebody finally stand up to Rankin. Now, Rankin wasn't very happy, but Rodino was very lucky because in the audience that day on the floor was a gentleman named Emanuel Seller, congressman from Brooklyn, Jewish American. Rankin was his number one enemy, and he was impressed with Peter Rodino. So the first vacancy that became available on the Judiciary Committee that was supposed to go to somebody from Illinois, Seller interfered and said, I'm giving this to Peter Rodino. So literally within 6 months, Peter Rodino ended up on the House Judiciary Committee, became Emanuel Seller's lieutenant, trusted lieutenant. But most important, he had an opportunity to then pursue the two issues that were most important to him. The first was immigration. In 1924, the United States adopted the most discriminatory immigration law in the history of the country. Prior to 1924, there were no laws. So anybody that says their grandparents came here legally, if they came before 1924, all that meant was they got off the boat, they passed the health screening, and they came in. There were no legal requirements. But in 1924, they passed an immigration bill that set quotas because they did not want Italians, they did not want Jews from Southeast Europe, and those quotas were very small. If you were a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant from England, from Norway, from Sweden, and by the way, those people were not interested in coming here. They had very big quotas. So the immigration from Italy declined overnight, 90%. Families that had hoped to be united to bring relatives over, it didn't happen. But more important than that, it was a stigma that was felt by every Italian American that said, you are not wanted, you are second class. And Rodino knew this growing up in Little Italy. So he was determined he was going to change this. And he started in 1950, trying and trying and trying. And it took, when we finally got a president whose grandparents were immigrants, John Kennedy, there finally was movement. And after President Kennedy's assassination, 1965, on Ellis Island, Lyndon Johnson signed the 1964 Immigration Reform Act that did away with the quotas and said, everybody is welcome here. We have these criteria. It doesn't matter where you come from. The second important issue for Peter Rodino was civil rights. Now, you might say, well, why was he interested in civil rights? In Little Italy, there were no African Americans. In his neighborhood, in the places that he traveled, he had very little interaction, direct interaction with African Americans. But he had seen how Italians were discriminated against. He himself had once been beaten up by the Newark police for just walking along the street. And this sense of injustice outraged him. And he said, it's not right. So starting in 1949, when he got into Congress, he introduced civil rights legislation. And when he got on the Judiciary Committee, he was part of that effort. And finally, year after year, they tried, but finally, the passage of the landmark 1964 Civil Rights Act. And I'm sure you're all familiar with that iconic photograph of the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. I'm sure you've seen it. It's Lyndon Johnson sitting in the White House, the east room of the White House, signing the law. Behind the Lyndon Johnson, right here, is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Right next to Dr. King, Peter Rodino. He was involved in that. He was involved in the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and then he led the floor effort for the Fair Housing Act, which did not pass until 1968. That effort on civil rights turned out to be beneficial for Rodino because in 1972, after the census and the redistricting that was required by the Supreme Court, Peter Rodino ended up with a congressional district, the 10th congressional district. The lines were redrawn. And instead of having a predominantly Italian American district, we had a majority African American district. And it was a Democratic district, so the key was the primary, getting the nomination, not the election. There was a lot of belief that he was not going to win. He had African American opponents. He could not win this. And if he did, he might win it one time, but that would be it. But again, people underestimated Rodino. They forgot about his record. And so Rodino went over to New York and asked A. Philip Randolph, icon of the civil rights movement, the founder of the Brotherhood of the Sleeping Car Porters, for his endorsement. A. Philip Randolph endorsed Rodino. Rodino had the endorsement of majority of the civil rights leaders. And on the primary night in June, I was there. So I can tell you firsthand, at the ballroom in the Robert Treat Hotel, all the reporters from New York, TV cameras were all there. Now, we all know New York television never cared about New Jersey. But they thought, we're going to have a great story here. We're going to see this 20-year congressional veteran is going to lose his seat. So they were there. Well, Rodino fooled. Not only did he win the primary, but he won in such a resounding way that it was clear that he could have the district for as ever long as he wanted. And in fact, he did represent that district until he decided to retire in 1988. Where the TV cameras were not was across the river in Brooklyn, where there was another primary battle. Manuel Seller was being challenged by an unknown young attorney, Elizabeth Holtzman. And to everybody's shock, she won by 800 votes. So in one fell swoop, Peter Rodino not only saved his congressional career, but in January, he was going to become the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee. And within 10 months, he was going to be leading the first presidential impeachment in over 100 years. Now, Rodino approached this impeachment, this burden, this responsibility with enormous humility and a lot of sleepless nights, you can appreciate. But he had some experience. He had been a member of a special committee back in the 1950s looking at political scandal in the Truman administration. Very politically sensitive. And he learned a few things from that experience, that it was important to be bipartisan. It was important to have a professional staff. And it was important to take your time to do the right thing. And so Rodino assembled the staff and they worked very diligently, very carefully, getting all of the material, trying to get tape recordings from the White House. And you can appreciate that there was enormous pressure on Rodino to get this done quickly. The Republicans wanted it done because they wanted to get this cloud away from Richard Nixon. The Democrats wanted it done because they wanted to get rid of Richard Nixon. And this pressure was constant. Every time Peter Rodino went to the floor of the House, Tip O'Neill, who was his dear friend and the majority leader, would come and sit next to him and start badgering him. Come on, Pete, hurry up, hurry up. But Rodino was not going to be rushed. And I want to use his words to convey what he felt. He said this on the floor of the House of Representatives, why he was proceeding so slowly, so carefully. Because he thought it was important that they proceed with such care and decency and thoroughness and honor that the vast majority of the American people and their children after them will say, this was the right cause. There was no other way. This was critical. So they proceeded. In May of 1974, they began behind closed doors, going through the evidence, listening to the recordings that they had of White House conversations, which was absolutely shocking, the Democrats and Republicans. And finally, in July, they convened in televised live hearings. I'm sure some of you here in the room tonight, I see the nods, you remember watching it. It was on, televised live on television. Eloquent speeches. You remember Barbara Jordan? Nobody knew who Barbara Jordan was. She just rose to that occasion. And the committee proceeded carefully. And in the course of 5 days, they voted in a bipartisan way 3 articles of impeachment against Richard Nixon. Exactly what Rodino was hoping for. And there was no celebration afterwards. When after the first vote, Rodino went to his little office near the committee, called his wife Ann here in Newark, started crying. It was a sad day, he felt, for everybody. As the committee was getting ready to prepare to go to the House of Representatives to continue the impeachment process, Richard Nixon resigned because he knew he was not going to be acquitted by the Senate. And it was over. Now, Rodino's life was totally changed. He really was regarded as Watergate's unexpected hero. He was lionized everywhere. And 80 million people had watched the impeachment. Everybody knew him. He was offered a lot of money to write a book. He was offered money to go on the paid lecture circuit, and he turned all those offers down. He said, it is not right for me to cash in. This was my job. I did the right thing. But what he was willing to do was to use his newfound fame to help elect Democrats to Congress, people who he agreed with. And he hit the road and he went all across the country giving speeches. And I interviewed for the book the former governor of Michigan, James Blanchard, who was then a congressman. And he said when Peter Rodino agreed to come to his district in Michigan, it was the most successful fundraiser he ever had. They actually had to have 2 dinners. They had so many people. He never forgot that. Rodino was so popular that as the country started moving towards the presidential election in 1976, there were some people who said, well, maybe Peter Rodino should run for president. The Boston Globe said, well, Peter Rodino has become the good housekeeping seal of American politics. Everybody wants to stand next to him. Everybody wants his glove. Maybe he should run for president. Rodino said, no, thank you, no. But a group of his colleagues in the Congress, led by Tip O'Neill, said, you know what, he should be vice president. So when it was clear that Jimmy Carter was going to be the Democratic nominee, they pressed and pushed and made sure that Peter Rodino was on the short list. He was one of 6 people on the short list to be Jimmy Carter's vice president. Now, you know, Rodino was a realist. He knew it was unlikely that he was going to get selected. So when it was his turn to be interviewed by Jimmy Carter, he said, I'm not going to go down to Georgia. I'll just meet with you when you're here in New York for the convention. And Rodino walked into Jimmy Carter's suite, and the first thing he said was, I'd like to take my name out of consideration because I want to stay in the Congress and I can help you. There are other people you can get. And Carter so appreciated it that he asked Rodino, would you then come to the convention and give the nominating speech for me? Which is what Peter Rodino did in front of millions and millions of people. And his years with Jimmy Carter, those were good years. Democratic chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, Democratic president. They were very close. But then, of course, 1980 came. And if you remember your history, not only did Ronald Reagan win, but it ushered in a whole wave, a new wave of conservatism that Washington had not seen for a long time. So Peter Rodino's job completely changed. And he joked that his job after 1980 was to be the boy with his finger in the dike. He was holding back the floodgates. And frankly, almost single-handedly, Peter Rodino stopped balanced budget amendments, amendments allowing prayer in school, constitutional amendments preventing school busing, all of these things that were part of a conservative political agenda, policy agenda, Rodino stopped. Some other things he was less successful. He tried very hard to stop a weakening of gun control laws. He was not successful in doing it. But he did do one positive thing. In 1986, he worked with the Reagan administration on immigration reform. Rodino had pioneered the idea that there were, back even in those days, there were a lot of undocumented migrants, immigrants in the United States. And they were being exploited. Rodino thought this isn't right. So we need to provide them with legal status. But yet if we do that, then everybody else is going to follow. So the goal was to provide an amnesty program with a cutoff date, strengthen border security, and then for the first time, have sanctions against employers who hire people who do not have the appropriate documents, linking all of this together. And the Reagan administration got interested in this idea, and working together, they passed in 1986 the Immigration Reform Act that did exactly those things that I said. It's the last time that Congress ever passed and enacted comprehensive immigration reform. And those people who benefited from the amnesty program in Mexico were known as Los Rodinos. He was very proud of that. So 1988, Peter Rodino, I was working for him then, and he was debating what to do. He was 78 years old. He had been in Congress at that point, 40 years longer than I had been alive with. And he decided he was going to retire. And he issued his statement and talked about his career and basically said, I have served my time and the purpose, and it's time to move on. And there was such an outpouring of admiration, of memory of what he had done during a time of national crisis. I can remember the clips, the news clips coming from Hawaii, California, all over the country, editorials, lionizing Rodino, interviews. He was getting awards from every kind of organization wanted to honor him before he left Congress. And there were so many of them. And I, luckily, because I was the speechwriter, I usually got to go along and witness all of these. But the one that I remember, the most memorable one, was when the Supreme Court of the United States hosted a reception to honor Rodino, to thank him for his service. And the speaker that night was Justice William Brennan. William Brennan was 2 years ahead of Rodino in high school. And his father, William Brennan Sr., had been the police commissioner here in Newark. And when Bill Brennan, Justice Brennan, got up to speak, he turned to Rodino and he said, well, Pete, I think we did pretty good for a couple of Barringer High School boys. And they certainly did. So Rodino left a life he had had for 40 years, but he got a new career. He became a professor at Seton Hall University Law School. It's where he decided that Harvard wanted his papers, Catholic University. He wanted his papers to be here in Newark, gave his papers to Seton Hall, and they created a professorship in his honor. And that's where he went and spent, the final chapter of his life. He kept a copy of the Constitution in his back pocket, always. He could recite the preamble of the Constitution by heart. If he was here tonight, he would do that for you. And he did this with his law students. I've heard this back from a lot of the students. And he would take each phrase, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, and explain what each of this meant and the ramifications and the things that had happened since the adoption of the Constitution and his own experiences. And he really did enjoy himself as a professor. He was treated like a VIP at the school and always in New Jersey, but maybe sort of a little bit forgotten nationally until 1998, when we had another presidential impeachment, the impeachment of Bill Clinton. And the Republicans and the Democrats all got on a train and came up to Newark to sit and listen to Peter Rodino and get his sage advice. And for a long time, Rodino didn't want to say anything publicly. He wasn't happy with the way the impeachment was being handled. His name was being invoked. He didn't think it was appropriate. But finally, he said, I can't be quiet anymore. And he did an interview with Cokie Roberts of ABC. Why did he pick Cokie Roberts? Because Cokie Roberts' parents were Hale Boggs, who had been the majority leader of the House, and Lindy Boggs, his wife. They were both dear friends of Rodino, and that's what mattered. So when Cokie called, he did it. And he talked about how he thought the Clinton impeachment was wrong, that what Clinton did was inappropriate, but it did not reach the level of high crimes and misdemeanors. And he thought it was very political, and he was very disappointed. And that really brought him back into the spotlight. And just as a footnote, I might add that in the two Trump impeachments, Rodino was no longer with us, but in both of those impeachments, Rodino was cited, and Rodino's management of the Nixon impeachment was cited by both sides as the gold standard of presidential impeachment. So I think when you're being cited by both sides, you obviously have done something right. So Rodino continued teaching until just a few months before he died. He got sick in the winter of 2005, and just a couple weeks shy of his 96th birthday, he died. They had a memorial for him at Seton Hall Law School, and then his funeral mass was at St. Lucy's Church. Those of you that know, it's probably one of the few remnants left of the old Little Italy, the old first ward. It's where Rodino was baptized, and it was the appropriate place to say goodbye to Peter Rodino. But in the audience were members of Congress, all living governors of New Jersey. It was quite a who's who of people there honoring Rodino. And there were so many accolades and tributes paid to him, but I want to just read one. I want to end with this because I think this really says it all of what people felt about Peter Rodino and what he managed to achieve coming from such humble origins with so many things against him, with so many things that could have gone wrong, that he could have went in a different direction, that he did the right thing and did the honorable thing. And this was a letter that was sent to Peter Rodino's widow by Senator Ted Kennedy. Many of us felt we were seeing a founding father in action, living the highest ideals of the Constitution. I am sure my brother would have called him a profile in courage. I feel the same way, and I'll never forget it. Kennedy was certainly, I think, not alone in recognizing that Peter Rodino had served his time and a purpose, and that he had earned his place as Watergate's unexpected hero. Thank you very much.
Going to try to do is, I'm going to check and see if there are any questions online, but we'll alternate. But Tom has a microphone if you have a question for Dr. Spinelli.
Yes, so, Rodino and you at Nezio were, I don't know, careers until like. You want to walk the rail, you're basically about that.
Well, yeah, actually, it's interesting. Rodino said, I mean, I don't have evidence of this, but in oral recordings, Rodino did a bunch of oral recordings that are at the Rodino archives. He said that when at Inizio, because they shared an apartment, and they used to ride on the train together, you know, they were called the Gold Dust Twins, and Damon and Pythias, they were sort of so closely identified that when Adonisio told him he was going to run for mayor of Newark, Rodino urged him not to do that. He thought he was really getting into a quagmire. So he advised him not to do that, and then he saw what happened and what ultimately unraveled. It was very difficult for Rodino. He never defended Adonisio once all of this came out, but he also didn't, you know, he didn't throw wood on the fire. That wasn't his style. But it was very disappointing to him because he felt that Adonisio had done a great job as a congressman, which he did, and it was just too bad. No, well, that's why he said that's why he became mayor. There was right. It was a much more lucrative thing. Ironically, and those of you that know your Newark history, I mean, it was sort of not a. Besides for the scandal, it was a very tense campaign that eventually Adonisio lost, and Ken Gibson became mayor. Ken Gibson and Rodino became great friends and great allies for the entire time that Gibson was the mayor of Newark. They worked very, very closely together.
I'll ask a question about Rodino as an attorney. Um, First, though, a friend and member of the Newark Fiction Society, Carol Jenkins, sent me a copy of the program from 1992 when Peter Rodino spoke here at the library with the Friends of the Newark Public Library. Simple program, but you can imagine what was on it, the preamble to the Constitution of the United States. No doubt it did the when Rodino was going to law school, how common was that among Newark's Italians? When I lived on Clifton Avenue, I lived next to a Mrs. Palladino who said that she had photographs from the evening event. They celebrated his graduation and such, and that she indicated that his graduating from law school was a big deal in Newark's Little Italy. Was that your impression?
Yeah, so first of all, the founding of the New Jersey Law School, that was a big deal. Because prior to that, you wanted to be a lawyer, you had to go to New York. You had to go full-time. And people that were working class, children of immigrants couldn't do that. So New Jersey Law School, it was here in Newark, eventually became part of University of Newark, eventually became Rutgers, made it possible to go in the evening. So that's sort of number one. Without that, Rodino would not have been able to do it. But even with that, it was very unusual. There were probably more Italian Americans that were ultimately became doctors than lawyers. It was not a usual thing. And the celebration you're talking about actually was when he passed the New Jersey bar and was sworn in. They had a big celebration at Vittorio's Castle, which was in the First War. It was a big dinner. So yeah, it was definitely a big deal. Mentioned the preamble. So, I worked for him and I met Peter Rodino in 1968. And when I was in Belleville High School. And I tell the story in the book. I was the president of the Belleville High School political. And there was one perk that you got with being the president of the political club. If anybody of importance came to the high school, I got to be at the door with the principal to greet them. Now, I have to tell you, nobody of importance ever came to Belleville High School. But one day, the principal, our wonderful principal, Mr. Smith, came to me and said, Congressman Rodino is going to come here to speak today, so you can meet him. Well, we all knew Peter Rodino in Belleville. He was our congressman. And so I met him. And I walked him out to the car when it was over, and I told him, I was president of a political club. They were really interested. I love politics, this and that. Well, being the smart politician that he was, about 2 days later, I got a call from his office saying, we understand that you and your friends like politics. Would you like to work on our campaign? Which was like, just music to our ears. So literally, on Friday nights and Saturday mornings, because we were all in the band, also we had to go to the football game, we would go to supermarkets in the 10th Congressional District with Rodino. We'd hand out brochures and say, would you like to meet the congressman? He'd shake me. And so that was, to paraphrase Casablanca, the beginning of a beautiful friendship. I worked on campaigns. I was an intern for 2 summers in Washington. I worked on that campaign, that primary campaign, that tough one. And then eventually spent summers in his office when I was a college professor. And then he asked me to become his press secretary. I had no experience to do that, but he had a bare experience with somebody he didn't know and said, I want somebody I know and trust, and I'll teach you how to do the job. And he did, and literally changed my life in every way. And so I worked in those final years for him, and I was his speechwriter. And every speech had to have some aspect of the preamble. So one time he said, I'm going to speak to the Boy Scouts in Caldwell. And I needed some remarks. And boy, that baffled me. These are Boy Scouts. What am I going to do? And then I remembered I was a Boy Scout. Oh, the Boy Scout oath. That's like the preamble of the Constitution. I wrote it that way. But that was one of the requirements. That was him. always, really right to the end. I mean, I spoke to him just literally, weeks before he got sick. And he was sharp as a tack and, I always use that frame of reference. That's very important.
There are a number of very positive remarks about your talk, but not yet a question online.
You made a statement that New York media doesn't care too much about New Jersey. A statement about New York media doesn't care too much about New Jersey. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
So that's my perspective as as somebody who lived in New Jersey and then worked for a congressman in New Jersey. We could never get New York television stations to, or certainly not newspapers, to cover anything that went on in New Jersey unless it was bad news. And there was a huge battle. I was still living here. It was Clifford Case was then the senator. The whole congressional delegation forced WOR Channel 9 to open up a New Jersey bureau. They had no New Jersey bureau. This is way before cable television. So New Jersey never got on the television stations, and the New York Times would do a little election coverage, and that was it. So that's why it was so unusual when I walked in that ballroom in 1972, and there literally were a bank of cameras and reporters there from New York. I knew that they smelled trouble.
But they still don't.
They
No, they
smelled-
still don't. Wait till the spring comes. When they talk about the cherry blossom, they will say, oh, New Jersey Park has more cherry blossoms than Washington DC, but they never say Newark.
Yeah.
Pay attention to, what is that?
Other questions? What was he like as a boss, as opposed to a legislator?
Well, as a boss, first of all, the one thing, I'm not hawking my book, but there's a lot of stuff in the book that I didn't talk about tonight. And one of the things was how much Rodino loved writing. He wanted to be a writer. He wrote poems. They're in the archives when he was in grammar school. And he wrote a novel called Drift Street about life in Little Italy that got lost, unfortunately. And he wrote song lyrics. He tried to make it as a lyricist right after the Depression. I don't know if any of you remember a singer called Russ Columbo. He was sort of like a junior Bing Crosby, very big among Italian Americans in the 1930s. Rodino pitched him a couple of songs. I tell you that because to be the speechwriter for Peter Rodino, that was tough because he was very demanding. But I learned so much from him because he said, Larry, make every word count. And I hope for those of you that read the book, you feel I did that. But he never raised his voice. He was demanding in the sense that he expected the best from you, but his staff stayed with him forever. And to me, that's the hallmark. There's a lot of congressional offices where it's like a revolving door. He had only 2 district administrators in Newark in 40 years. And the first one, Joe Benucci, left because he became the postmaster. And he had a dear friend of mine who I interviewed for the book, who's still alive, in her 80s. She went to work for him right out of high school, and she worked for him until he left. So there were a lot of people like that, really felt that he was really he was a good person to work for. But honestly, I never heard him, never raised his voice. But the one thing I have to just tell you one story, unless there's another question, because the thing that was great about him is how much he just, even after he announced his retirement and he wasn't going to run for re-election, this was never about politics. Every Monday, he'd come in on the airplane, take the shuttle, and he'd walk back into our staff room. He'd always come in and say hello to everybody, ask us how we were. And he'd come back to my desk and start handing me things he'd ripped out of the Star Ledger. And it was like, this person died, Larry, send a condolence letter. This person got married, send a congratulations letter. Nicenson the Hatter is 75 years in business. Put something in the congressional record. I want to bring it home next week. He always was on top of all of that. Those constituents, that constituent services. That's why he was in Congress 40 years. When I went to be his intern in 1971, that was a big deal in Belleville. Rodino was a big deal. Two ladies from my church, my Sunday school teachers, grabbed me one day. I was walking down the street. They said, "We hear you're going to Washington to be an intern for Congressman Rodino." And we just want you to know that we are Republicans. We've been Republicans all our life. And they started telling me the story, but in 1955, they had some problem and Rodino solved it. So ever since then, we go in, we vote for all the Republicans and Peter Rodino. Yes.
I was just wondering to what extent he became involved in the question of who would be his successor. Because from what I've read, I understand there was considerable pressure to black and leaders in Newark agitated that. Right. I wondered,
So yeah, I'm going to repeat. So the question was Rodino involved in the process of selecting his successor, who was Donald Payne? The answer is no. Donald Payne actually ran against Rodino in the primary in 1984. I mean, in 1986, sorry, and didn't win. And then as soon as Rodino announced his retirement, he got into the race and was the front runner. Rodino always believed that when he left, that the district should be represented by an African American. It was a majority African American district. His argument prior to that, particularly through the 80s with Reagan in power, was I'm the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, and I can do more with this seniority. If you elect a freshman instead of me, it's going to take 20 years for them to get the seniority. I can bring federal dollars home to Newark. I can fight the Reagan administration. When Reagan goes, then, you know, my job is over, and that's what he did.
Larry, perhaps one last question from Zoom. Again, back to the Watergate hearings. What obstacles did he face in structuring the hearings, and why was it successful?
Well, the biggest obstacle I think that he had working against him were the time pressure, first of all, and then he had a committee, Democrats and Republicans. And on one side, you had liberal Democrats who decided even before they started the inquiry that Nixon was guilty and he should be impeached. You had on the other side, Republicans, conservative Republicans, most notably Charles Sandman from Cape May County, New Jersey, who said, no matter what, we think Nixon is innocent. So dealing with the middle, Rodino said, I want to get the moderate Republicans, I want to get the conservative Democrats, and to see if we can forge this consensus. It was very difficult, very challenging. The White House blocked them, thwarted them every step of the way with giving them evidence, with giving them the paper prints. I don't know if you all remember the famous when Nixon said, well, I'm not going to give you the tapes, I'll give you the transcripts. I'm going to make the transcripts up. So we went on national television and he had all these boxes behind me. These are all the transcripts. So he sent them up. So for a while, he kind of, won that debate. It looked good. He's cooperating. Well, when the transcript arrived, they opened them up. First of all, half the boxes were empty. And the other half were transcripts that didn't match the transcripts that the committee had put together of the tapes they had. So there was clearly a lot of doctoring, but Nixon outfoxed himself. Because then he said, well, just to show you I have nothing to hide, I'm going to publish all these transcripts. So we went over to the government printing office. They published it. It sold out in less than a day. It was like a bestseller. It was reprinted in all the newspapers. But what Nixon didn't count on was when people read this, even these doctored transcripts, all this black marks of redacted material, all these expletives deleted, and all this rough language, people were horrified that the president of the United States was having conversations like this. So the public actually, within a couple of days, turned against him, so he outfoxed himself. At the end of the day, Rodino's proudest achievement was this. And I'll end on this positive note. While he got a bipartisan vote, he got 6 Republicans voting for the first article of impeachment, 6 for the second, and less for the third. When the Supreme Court forced Nixon to release all the tapes, including the smoking gun tape, where you hear Nixon literally 3 days after the break-in telling the CIA to get the FBI to stop investigating this, an absolutely clear obstruction of justice. When that tape was released and the Republicans on the House Judiciary Committee heard that tape, all of them, including Nixon's biggest defenders, came out, talked to the press, and expressed their horror. And they filed a concurrent report with the Judiciary Committee report that said, if we had heard this evidence before we voted, we would have all voted on that first article of impeachment that President Nixon was guilty of obstructing justice. So at the end of the day, Rodino got a unanimous vote, and that's really what he wanted. And that was his proudest achievement. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Really a splendid talk. Thank you so much. The NJ Pack folks don't have time. They were having a drawing for Thursday night concert, and they trusted me with this. And I'm going to kind of scoot these around, and I'm going to pull out. Seven 3685. So if you have that, I have 2 tickets for you. But thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you to the 4 or 5 dozen people who joined us on Zoom. And thank you again, Dr. Spinelli, for a splendid talk. Thank you and good night.